I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. According to the Gun Violence Archive, since the start of 2019, there have been 249 mass shootings in the United States. 4 of these took place last week. Two mass shootings happened only 13 hours apart, one at Walmart at the city of El Paso and one in a popular entertainment district at Dayton, Ohio. The shootings killed 29 people. As these shootings become more and more frequent, the debate now must also take into account the ideological factors at play. Is there a rise in homegrown white nationalist terrorism in the United States? On today's show, we discuss this topic in greater depth. Joining us for this discussion is Jeff Seldin, the national security correspondent for The Voice of America. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. And we're also joined by James Dorsey, an analyst joining us from Singapore. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Dorsey, now let me begin with you. This number I've stated, this fact, 249 mass shootings in the U.S. so far. What do you make of it?
I think we're dealing with two separate issues. One are gun laws in the United States and access to automatic weaponry, which really shouldn't be the case. The second issue that we're dealing with, and they do intersect, is the fact that we have a climate in which supremacism, and that's global, not just in the United States, in which supremacism, whether that's religious or national or ethnic, is increasingly becoming mainstream. And government leaders, including President Trump, have created environments in which those kind of views and those kind of actions become more or less taboo and to a degree more acceptable.
Right. And as you're mentioning here, that a political climate has been created which allows for this to happen. That's something we're going to talk about in greater depth. But before that, I'd like to jump to Mr. Seldin and talk to him about what has come out of these last 2 shootings. Have the motives been confirmed? What do we know so far about it?
For the shooting in El Paso, authorities have come out and said that they are looking at this as a domestic terrorism type case. They say the motive, according to a screed that the shooter posted online on social media before the shooting, clearly shows that it was hate-based, that he was going out, he told authorities he wanted to shoot as many Mexicans as he could, and indeed he targeted many when he went to the Walmart and killed 20. In the second shooting, the motive, officials have not come out and said what it is. It's not quite clear. But this is something, both shootings, that has worried U.S. officials for some time now. The U.S. Secret Service, which mainly protects the President of the United States, has something called the National Threat Assessment Center, and they've been looking at mass casualty attacks for about 2 years now. And the last data they have comes from 2018, and they said that when they've looked at it, many times these shootings involve a mental health aspect, that the person who's behind the attack has had some sort of mental health issues or problems. But they also said that there's no other than that, and the fact that many times these shooters may kill themselves at the scene. There's not much to unify. There's not much that brings together as a common symptom all these attacks. They also say that when they look at mass casualty attacks from 2018, they found only 2 that were actually based in ideology. That said, the FBI in the United States and many counterterrorism experts have for some time been sounding the alarm that while a lot of the focus in the U.S. has been on Islamic terror, jihadist terror, the foreign fighters who travel to Syria and Iraq to fight many times with the Islamic State terror group, that they've been seeing a similar phenomenon with white nationalists, white supremacists, sometimes they call themselves the alt-right, where there are similar emotions where there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration, and there's a willingness to take some sort of action, whether it's going somewhere or committing some sort of act here at home.
Right. So it seems like the counter-terrorism strategy or the defense mechanisms in place in the United States are recognizing this as a growing threat. But my question here is, Mr. Seldin, do you think they have acted too late upon it? And do you think there is enough momentum to act upon it strongly at this point in time?
Well, it depends which side of the political aisle that you talk to. The Democrats, who are very critical of President Trump, have been making a lot of political hay. They've been complaining a lot about the need for more measures to crack down on white nationalists who they say, because of some of the rhetoric that comes from the White House, have been emboldened. Republicans, many of whom support President Trump, say that's just not the case, that the president has been unequivocal in his condemnation of shootings and attacks like this, and that the problem really is that there are bad people out there, and one way or another, they're going to find a way to do bad things. And mixed into this, you have what's been a big political issue.
But do you personally, Mr. Seldin, sorry to interrupt here, but do you think, what's your take on this? Do you think that the president has had a strong enough stance when it comes to white nationalist terrorism that is homegrown?
As a reporter who covers this, I really don't take any opinions. I can tell you, though, what people within the national security community here in the U.S. say, what the experts say, and they say, and the experts, the national security officials, the people who look at the terrorists, whether it's domestic or overseas, they do see a worrying trend where people, no matter what the ideology, whether it's jihadist ideology, whether it's left-wing ideology, whether it's right-wing ideology, have been more emboldened to take action. And so they present that to the policymakers, to the lawmakers, and to the president. But then it becomes a political issue. And what are the politicians going to do about that?
Right. Mr. Dorsey, now talk to you about all that Mr. Seldin has briefed us on. He talked about the defense aspect of it and what the experts are saying. And before I put my question to you, I'd like for us to listen to Trump's reaction to the shootings in a press conference. Let's take a listen to it.
We have done much more than most administrations, and it's not really not talked about very much, but we've done actually a lot, but perhaps more has to be done. But this is also a mental illness problem. If you look at both of these cases, this is mental illness. These are really people that are very, very seriously mentally ill.
So, Mr. Dorsey, as we heard here, Trump briefing reporters and talking about hate has no space in the United States. It seems that it comes at a point when, after a while, he has spurred up many racist sentiments. I mean, he attacked 4 Democratic congresswomen. He talked to them in a way that was appalling all across the board. And then he comes and says this. Do you also see a contradiction in this regard?
Not necessarily. I think that we're dealing with, again, 2 issues. One issue is there's no doubt that Trump has condemned violence. And let's face it, he has no choice but to condemn violence. And I don't question his sincerity in terms of his condemnations. But at the same time, he has created an environment. And we go back to 2016, where he described Mexicans as rapists.
Right.
One of his first measures was to target Muslims. Muslims as such, at least Muslims from 6 or 7 countries, were en masse to be barred entry into the United States. He played with what is viewed as racist terminology when he talked about going back home. And implicit in his comments that you just displayed, in terms of if you don't like the United States, you can go home, is the notion that if you're criticizing policies, and particularly his policies, that equates not liking the United States rather than wanting to have a better United States. So I think there is a systematic sequence of expressions that are problematic and that create an environment that, by the way, that is not new in the United States. It has historical roots.
Right, but here, Mr. Dorsey, now you're using a very careful language here when you're talking about the effects that Trump might have had on the population. But Democrats have come out with much, much stronger language. I mean, Cory Brooks just came out in an interview. He said that Trump is directly responsible for what is happening. I mean, when you dehumanize people, when you put migrants in cages, when you let those images out, when you tell people that that migrants from Mexico are that are rapists and murderers, this is what happens. And as the El Paso shooter claimed that he was afraid that Hispanics would take over. So is it something more than just saying that Trump is igniting the fire? Maybe he's causing it to become a full-blown out process.
I think that in moral terms, and particularly he has the most important pulpit in the United States and one of the most important pulpits in the world, and he sets a tone. So he has moral responsibility for what is happening. I don't think you could argue that he has legal responsibility, but he has moral and political responsibility beyond doubt.
Right. Mr. Seldin, going back to you, talking a little more about the homegrown terror and homegrown threat within the United States. Do you think that there's enough being done on the defense mechanism to now start take action against it? And do you think that they're realizing that the dominant threat is that?
There's been a lot of concern. And as I mentioned, the National Threat Assessment Center has looked at this. And one of the things that they said is that the most effective thing that can be done in the case of any person who may be prone to commit some sort of mass violence, mass attack, something that, whether it's a shooting or a vehicle attack that leaves multiple people dead and injured, is that there are often warning signs ahead of time. And it's incumbent upon the people who know the individual to be able to step forward. And they're also working with states and local governments across the country on ways that they can provide better support for those people. So it's not just a matter of calling up and trying to call an emergency line at the last moment, but finding ways to help people ahead of time. One of the things that they're also looking at is something that's been tried with what's been called CVE, or countering violent extremism. And it's been applied mostly in the case of would-be foreign fighters, people who are inspired by ideology, whether Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, and were trying to go or actually went to Iraq and Syria to fight, or tried to carry out attacks here inspired by ISIS or Al-Qaeda, is early intervention, creating a situation where the local communities can provide better support. That said, that's very, very difficult because at the same time that there are some commonalities with some of the people who are carrying out these attacks, a lot of times the research has been showing, according to the Threat Assessment Center and others, that the motivations can often be very, very individualistic. So what sets one person off to commit mass atrocity isn't the same trigger that's going to affect somebody else. And so there's been a call from various communities, national security, and also from mental health experts saying that there needs to be more in place to enable people to take action earlier, because often there are some early indications. That said, it's very, very difficult, especially when you look at the factor of social media, where people are able to suddenly go out, go on their computer, go on their mobile phone, and can be connected to material, conspiracy theories, hate speech, or anything else that might make it easier for them or might make them feel more enabled or more emboldened.
Mr. Seldin, given everything that you're saying, I just want to read out a report by the California State University. It showed that in 2018, there was a national rise in hate crimes and that almost all extremist homicides were carried out by the far right. The most frequently targeted were blacks, Jews, and LGBTQ people. Now, given all of this, and we're talking about how there is this understanding that there needs to be community support extended out before it gets to a point where a person commits this sort of an act, do you think the narrative would have changed had these shooters been people of a different ethnicity, of a different religion?
Look, when you have attacks by terrorists and they tend to be foreign terrorists, it stirs a different type of emotion in a country. And for people in the United States, when you talk about a foreign terror attack, most of them will think back to the September 11th, 2001 attacks, where the World Trade Center was brought down, the Twin Towers were brought down, and where parts of the Pentagon were destroyed and thousands of people lost their lives. So there's a different type of muscle memory that in a way that people react when they talk about a foreign threat as opposed to a domestic threat. That said, the FBI has come out with its own statistics saying, look, white nationalists, white supremacy, domestic terrorism is something that is of a prime concern. It doesn't capture the American imagination right now in the same way. That is beginning to change, and you're hearing more and more of a political debate about it. But then again, it comes down to the politicians. What do they want to do, and what is there a political will within the country to do about this? Because the solutions, whether the motivation is whether it's white supremacist ideology, the individual motivations are different, and it is difficult sometimes to reach people early enough and get them the right resources to head off an attack before it happens.
Right. Mr. Dorsey, going to you and how, Mr. Seldin, that it now comes down to the politicians. Do you think there will be any bipartisan move to take this situation, grip it, and actually face it head on? Or do you think it's just going to become banter, people are going to grieve, but then they are going to move on? I mean, in the beginning, you pointed out to two issues. One is ideology and one is gun laws. It seems like these things, these incidents continuously repeat and nothing is done about them.
I think it's wait and see, but if I were to have to place a bet, I would say the country is too polarized at this point to bring them really together on structural issues. Structural issues meaning, one, gun control, but two, what my colleague has been describing is really, in terms of policy, reductive. So with other words, you're talking about preventing through community work, whereas the problem is much broader. One of the issues, for example, is that a lot of these people live in basically echo silos. They don't hear anything else. The problem is not going to be resolved by driving this underground. The problem is going to be by breaking through these silos so that you have access to a multitude of opinions and a multitude of perspectives. And therefore, this is not the only thing you are hearing, and there's more that you can, in one way or the other, possibly relate to.
Right. Mr. Dorsey, just a last question to you before we wind up. Now, we talked about how this is not just an issue facing the United States when we talk about white nationalism or white supremacy. It's a global phenomena. We saw it in New Zealand. We saw it in Quebec, in Canada. Now, with that, what needs to be done at the global front to take this into account and take measures against it?
I think the problem that we're facing is that we have a critical mass of world leaders, whether that is President Trump, whether that is Russian President Putin, whether that is Chinese President Xi Jinping, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, Narendra Modi in India, who are all thinking in terms of civilizationalist terms. They're thinking in terms which are exclusionary. They exclude minorities. They exclude the other. And that is a formula that leads to the kind of violence and the kind of problems that we see. We don't have a world leadership that understands we're going down the wrong road.
Right. And on that note, thank you so much, James Dorsey, for joining us from Singapore. And thank you, Jeff Seldin, for joining us from Washington, D.C. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to have another story for you. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Now, last week, Israeli forces demolished over 100 homes in Wadi al-Hummus, in the Palestinian neighborhood situated in the southeast of Jerusalem. Families stood watching as their homes turned to rubble. But with international condemnation pouring in after the destruction, will anything change for the displaced families and all those who suffer? Or will things continue as business as usual? On today's episode, we take a closer look at this story. Joining us on the show is Mr. Ahmed Jamal, who's a consultant strategic intelligence and an analyst of Middle East geopolitics. He's joining us from Ghana. We're also joined by Mr. Omar, who's the chief editor of the Palestinian Issue magazine. He's joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Ghiyatha, let me begin with you. Now, this demolishing of homes, the destruction of homes, is this unprecedented when we talk about how Israeli forces are dealing with the Palestinians?
Sadly, Israel has a policy of demolishing Palestinian homes, using the excuses of no permit to build, or for this instance, the 70 flats that were demolished and about 10 properties in the east of Jerusalem There were claims that they were too close to the separation wall and that there were security concerns for Israel. And they've used that excuse to take it to the High Court, and they ordered to demolish these. Is a policy. It's used to demolish the families' homes of Palestinians who get involved in any incidents that threat the security of Israel.
Right. Mr. Jamal, as Mr. Ghiyatha was talking to us about how the Israeli forces say that this was a security concern and therefore demolishing these homes was necessary. What do you think about that claim?
Well, if you look at past history, almost all the demolitions in Israel with regards to the Palestinians has been under the guise of security concerns. The recent Israeli Supreme Court ruling gave justification to set these precedents. As your previous guest was talking about, there were 17 buildings and approximately 100 units, residential units, that were destroyed or set for destruction. So this is not something that is unique to this situation at all. This is a strategy of forced displacement of Palestinians, given that the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are under the authority of the PA, as per the Oslo Accords. So they are outside of the municipality jurisdiction of the Israeli authorities. In other words, they should not be allowed to demolish homes there.
Right.
And that's pretty much what you have right now.
Right, and yet they did so. What is the larger strategy here? Now, a lot of experts are claiming that this is just one other step in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. This is the Zionist project unfolding since the creation of what we are calling Israel today. It has been the forced displacement of the indigenous population, be they Palestinian Arabs, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Jews, or even secular Palestinians. So this has been ongoing. There have been some gaps, delays in implementation, but as you see, under Barak, under Netanyahu, under previous prime ministers, there's been a systematic approach to this.
Right.
It's designed for forced displacement of Palestinians to discourage them from coming back.
Right.
It's psychological as well as physical.
Right, and that's an important point you make there. It's psychological as it is physical, and that's something I do talk about, the human angle to all of this. But before that, I want to talk to Mr. Ghiyatha about the systematic ethnic cleansing. What do you think about it, and what more can you tell us about it? How widespread is it?
Well, Israel wants to control the whole of Jerusalem. And the fact that the Palestinian Authority control the east of Jerusalem, I think they have ignored this totally. As my colleague said, these homes were built as permitted by the Palestinian Authority, who has control in the east of Jerusalem. But Israel doesn't seem to care about the decisions the Palestinian Authority make, and basically there is a fight about who's a sovereign authority in Jerusalem. Obviously, we believe the east of Jerusalem should be under the Palestinian Authority's sovereignty, and we believe that east of Jerusalem should be the capital of Palestine. So Israel should not demolish homes of Palestinians in anywhere, not just in East Jerusalem. And the fact that it's demolishing Palestinian individuals' properties that causes a lot of damage to the owners of these properties. I have read about one building that was of a 9-story that has costed 9 million Israeli shekel, and is charging the owners the cost of the demolition, which is 2.5 million shekel as well. So
right.
This is unfair to Palestinian residents, and it's almost pushing people to leave and immigrate, and it's part of putting pressure on people to be not
right.
being able to build in Jerusalem and to leave Jerusalem altogether.
Right. And Mr. Jamal, this move with this destruction, we know it's not unprecedented. It's happened before, and it's almost creating a pattern of how Israel treats Palestinians and the residents there. But how is this going to change future demolishings of infrastructure, of civilian infrastructure? I mean, does this allow for something more to happen?
Well, absolutely. You have to understand that three things happened this past month. First of all, with the Supreme Court ruling that gives the Israeli authorities justification for these demolitions, in other words, a blank card. Second thing, the Netanyahu vowing that settlements will be annexed and they will not be removed in any future peace process. Thirdly is the U.S. veto of the UN resolution that was supposed to condemn these demolitions. It was rejected the first time. They requested a more watered-down version, and it was rejected again by the U.S. So you see there's a platform being empowered for the Israelis by the Americans to pretty much do what they want. In terms of future demolitions, again, look at the past history. Nothing has stopped Israel from stopping these demolitions. There have been suspensions of demolitions but it hasn't stopped. It will continue as per this strategy of forced displacement to make life so unbearable, so uncomfortable that Palestinians inevitably want to move. I mean, we're talking about the Trump peace plan here to have Jordan absorb their Palestinian refugees, have Lebanon absorb the Palestinians, and have Egypt. So they are actually trying to distribute that blame responsibility that they should carry for displacing these people onto the Arab countries that have hosted these refugees for a while. And this will give you an indication of what will happen in the future. It's a systematic approach that is being designed very, very well. It's a tactical approach, and it's very, very effective so long as the Trump administration allows it and the European Union does not put teeth to their condemnations of Israeli abuses and human rights violations.
Right, but the UN envoy Aaron Pierce said after the demolitions took place that was particularly egregious. I mean, she acknowledged the fact that they happened in an area which was under Palestinian jurisdiction after the Oslo Accords. I mean, there seems to be an international recognition of what's happening, but nothing's going to change in the future, as you say. Nothing will change in the future in terms of stopping Israel from going on this path. Mr. Ghiyatha, do you agree with that as well?
I would say that Israel is taking measures in Jerusalem, such as the withdrawing of Palestinians' IDs. So if you are Palestinian and live in East Jerusalem, and if you travel abroad or if you don't live in Jerusalem for a certain period of time, then you lose your right to live in Jerusalem, you lose your ID, you lose your residence status. So this is part of the policy to push people out of Jerusalem. And people almost have to prove they are the Jerusalemites, otherwise they would not be allowed to live in Jerusalem. But internationally, it is a shame that the U.S. seem to be blindly supporting the position of Israel, and they provide them the protection they need internationally. In particular, the Security Council in the United Nations seem to be unable to condemn such atrocities and unable to condemn such malicious acts. And this brings difficulties and obstacles before any long-lasting solution or peaceful solution in the region. And we have noticed that France, Germany, Britain have condemned the demolition of these homes. However, we are yet to see pressure from these countries on Israel, or even negotiations with the U.S. not to block international resolutions in the United Nations Security Council, for the U.S. to stop blindly supporting Israel, for the U.S. to be the mediator of peace, and for them not to act in such a way that they are siding with the oppressor.
Right. On that note, thank you so much, Mr. Qaid Omar Ghiyatha, for joining us from London. Mr. Jamal, going back to you and talking about the United Nations Security Council and how whenever this issue comes up, the U.S. vetoes it, it exercises its control over the House. Has the United Nations Security Council become completely ineffective, completely futile and useless, especially when we're talking about Palestine?
Especially when we're talking about Palestine, yes, because there are other interests at play here, specifically regarding the U.S. And let's not forget, the EU also has interest in Israel. Why? Because you're talking about French citizens with dual citizenship, with Israeli citizenship. You have Germans, you have British, you have citizens from all walks of life in Europe. So when these condemnations come from the EU member states, they're coming as token patronizing. There are no real teeth, because if the EU really wanted to apply pressure on Israel, they'd suspend trade relations, they would suspend this preferred status that they give to Israeli technological partnerships in various industries and public sectors. So there are different ways and varied ways that they could actually apply pressure, but they're not doing it. Why? There are secondary motives that are there behind all this that's happening. And unfortunately, the UN Security Council has become ineffective with regards to the Palestinian issue.
Right.
Perhaps one way of resolving this is to include more member states in the permanent member states in the USC as a alternative to the sort of monopoly these member states have.
Right. Mr. Jamal, just picking up on that point you mentioned, that these condemnations are just a small token. I mean, if they actually wanted to take some practical measures, they would apply pressure. Now, what do you think is the need for this facade at this point in time specifically? I mean, these condemnations, there does seem to be, with the UN reports coming out, with Amnesty International, all these human rights groups showing about and telling the world about these atrocities, there does seem to be an increasing use of this facade. What do you think is the reason behind that?
Well, international condemnation is not necessarily similar to what happens on the national level. On the national level, you have strong lobbying groups that are pro-Israel, pro-Zionist project, and that lobby these politicians, that make campaign contributions. There are in various districts within these member states, they can't get elected without these campaign contributions. So they are very, very much aware of this internal dynamic that also is projected onto the international scene. So we have to be very, very cognizant of that. Again, the EU can condemn all at once, but nationally, to actually impose sanctions, to actually have an effect, member states individually have to understand, accept, and realize this is what they need to do, then cooperate on the international level to achieve that objective. Right now, it's not happening.
Right. On that note, thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed, for joining us from Ghana. Now we're also joined by Akram Al Sattari, who's the head of the International Relations Department at Savide Association for Relief and Development, joining us from Gaza. Thank you so much, Mr. Sattari, for joining us. Now, while we're talking about all these demolitions and the fact that they're not unprecedented, they continuously happen, let's talk about the human angle of it, the displacement of it all. What is the situation on ground?
Well, the situation of underground is the fact that it is not the only process that is taking place, and it seems to be an integrated process where all the Israeli practices feed into a larger process with an ultimate goal of emptying the Palestinian population in East Jerusalem and in Jerusalem, and making Jerusalem Al-Quds as the Jewish and actual state, an actual capital of the Jewish state. There are some other policies that are being taken by the Israeli occupation, such as accepting and endorsing and funding some larger numbers of residential units in the settlements neighborhoods, so with an ultimate goal, which is Judaization of the of Al-Quds, Jerusalem, and reaching a political stage where there would be nothing to claim when it comes to Jerusalem in particular.
Right. On that note, just stay with us, Mr. Sattari, as I also introduce Dr. Munir Nuseibah, who's a human rights lawyer joining us from Jerusalem. Thank you so much, Dr. Nuseibah, for joining us. Now, while we're talking about all of this, and we touched upon the legal aspect of it, the legality of the buildings that were being demolished, what area were they under? Were they under the Palestinian Authority, under the Oslo Accords? They were allowed to be there. Give us a sense of that. Shed some light on that situation.
Yes, indeed. The houses that were demolished, part of them were under the Palestinian Authority administration area, which includes what is defined as Area A, which is totally under both civil and security administration of the Palestinian Authority, and Area B, which is under the civil administration of the Palestinian Authority. And many of these homes had actually permits from the Palestinian Authority to be built, so they were not even illegal, not under any regulation. However, the Israeli authorities decided to demolish these
permits. Sorry, Dr. Nuseibah, for interrupting there, but just a clarification: these permits they were from the Israeli authorities as well.
The Palestinian authorities mainly, but the Palestinian authorities, because they do have the jurisdiction, even according to their agreements with the Israeli occupation authorities, they have the jurisdiction to issue these permits. And this was also the new and strange thing. Under Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority is the authority that actually issues permits to build in areas A and B. And therefore, by doing what it did, Israel also breached the Oslo Accords. And they used a security justification. It's very important here to say that these demolitions are illegal under public international law, most importantly, international humanitarian law and international criminal law. An occupying power is not allowed to displace civilians in occupied territory. And this is exactly what these demolitions have been. These demolitions are basically displacing civilians from their homes by the occupying power, which is criminal under international law. That's why it is very important for the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction now over the occupied Palestinian territory, to intervene at a certain point.
Right. Going back to you and talking about this displacement, how many people have been displaced because of this? And as Dr. Nuseibah mentioned, that this was very shocking and surprising. It was something new. After this, what do you think is to follow?
Well, as a result of that most recent process, I would say security and military process that was conducted with the support of the Israeli occupation army and with also the police in that area, at least 100 families were displaced. At least 100 families do not have shelter right now. And I think Israel is going to further intensify its measures against that part of Jerusalem, Al-Quds. And like was mentioned by Dr. Munir, those people are living under the sovereignty of the Palestinian Authority, and that particular incident showed that no one has a safe haven when it comes to the Israeli settlement activity and when it comes to the policies aiming at displacing Palestinians and emptying the land of Jerusalem from who they think are the others who have no right to stay in that area.
Right. And what is, whose responsibility do these 100 displaced families now become? I mean, they're without shelter, without home, without resources. Who is taking care of them?
Well, I would say they're taking care of themselves. I'm not aware of any kind of intervention that was taken by the Palestinian Authority. That, by the way, doesn't mean there were no activities there, but I think people are receiving the minimum support they need, are receiving the minimum support they deserve. They are not being taken care of, and they would have to look after themselves through the support of their families and their relatives and friends as well.
These conditions of how people are left without shelter, they have a lack of resources. We know that the unemployment rate is extremely high for the Palestinians there. When you hear about stories, when you deal with cases, what do you think about the situation? Who's helping them? Are there any organizations on ground that are providing relief, that are working towards their betterment, or have they just been left to fend for themselves?
No, there are some people who are providing relief in Jerusalem. Maybe I should say that it's not enough, but there are organizations that are providing legal aid, for example. Unfortunately, here the legal aid did not bear any fruits because at the end of the day, the case was lost in the Israeli Supreme Court, and the Israeli Supreme Court decided to allow this crime to happen, as of course happens in many cases, unfortunately. But also you have a number of UN agencies that do provide certain support. The Palestinian Authority in some cases also provides support. So in this case, the Palestinian Authority has said that it will provide support. They said that they will provide compensation for the families who have lost their homes. I haven't followed up to learn whether this actually has happened or not, but I did hear that this is the case. But the problem is that it's very important not to only limit support to humanitarian support and to crisis support. I think there needs to be some international action to stop this systematic violation. While the details of this incident are new in a certain case, in a certain way, what I would say is that this forced displacement is a systematic policy that Israel has been implementing since 1948 until today, and it has never stopped. I work in a center that called the Community Action Center, Al-Quds University, which is based in the Old City, and we provide legal assistance to a number of Palestinians who are victims of forced displacement based on different justifications. This was the security justification in this case. But if you look, you will find that some people are being displaced from the city because they have traveled for a certain number of years abroad and then they never managed to come back because the Israeli law also prevents them from coming back. You would find that some homes were demolished as a collective punishment because Israel accuses one member of the family of being a terrorist, and therefore they demolish the home of the whole family because of that. So Israel, I would just
so Dr. Nuseibah, as you're saying here, that the reasons are plenty for why they are taking away the homes of Palestinian people, for why they're not allowing them to stay there, but the outcome is the same. I mean, there's people suffering all around. There is massive displacement. Mr. Sattari, just before we wrap up the show, a last question to you. As Dr. Nuseibah also mentioned that there needs to be international intervention. We touched upon this point earlier, that doesn't seem to be going in the Palestinians' favor. What do you see in the coming future?
Well, I see more of the same in the coming future. I see the Israeli occupation continuing to take over the land, to destroy and undermine livelihood and hopes of the people in Jerusalem. And I see them inspired, the Israeli occupation inspired by a prophecy, a religious prophecy that promised them, according to their Torah, that promised them this holy land and what they call the Holy Pasin. They are working day and night, and they are using all the power they have and all the political support and also the silence of the Arab and Muslim world to continue changing the demographics and the dynamics and the geography of the land in the area of Jerusalem. And they'll continue to do so, and they'll never stop their activities unless something tangible has been done. And unfortunately, allow me to say that with the Arab League seeming to be non-existent, and with the Muslim leaders not doing enough to stop the Israeli occupation, they'll continue their activity, they'll continue swallowing the land, they'll continue working towards an ultimate goal, which they think is their right, which is the full control over the land of Palestine and Jerusalem.
Right. On that note, it seems that things for Palestinians are not going to improve anytime soon. Israeli forces have all the international support when it comes to it. I mean, international condemnation is there, but it's not doing much to help the real on-ground situation. That's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank my guest, Akram Al Sattari, for joining us from Gaza, and Dr. Munir Nuseibah for joining us from Jerusalem. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.